Good morning. On behalf of my colleagues who are present on this panel today, and also on behalf of the organizers of this wonderful symposium, it is my pleasure to welcome you into our ongoing discussion about the means and ends of social change. My name is Elizabeth De Souza, and I was asked to introduce our theme today. And as I sat down to prepare these opening remarks, it seemed obvious, but also somehow important to begin by acknowledging the historic moment that we have now arrived at in our long-standing efforts to build a world that is just and equitable for one and all. The events of the past year in particular have laid bare the enormity of all that these efforts have accomplished and all that these efforts have not yet accomplished. Many people have noted that the United States is in the midst of what is being called the largest movement for social justice in our country's history, and that this movement has implications that are worldwide. And so many of us are wondering, could this time be different? Could the conditions imposed by a global health crisis and the floodlight that it's pointed at the various forms of injustice and oppression that we have been facing, could we finally have reached a point of no return? So there's no doubt that the need for collective action has never been greater. And yet the same technology that's revealed to us in devastating detail the precise conditions that so many of us find completely intolerable, that same technology is also revealing to us in that same devastating detail just how far we are from reaching a consensus on exactly what it is we need to do and exactly how we need to do it, how we should accomplish these mighty tasks. So interestingly, we're somehow both closer to and further from collective action than we've ever been before. And a good example of this, and a sad and unfortunate example of this, is our scattered and discordant approach to combating this pandemic. There are, however, many common threads that have emerged at the same time. And one of them is the pressing need to build systems that are markedly different from those that we have been trying to reform for so long. And all of us who are participating in this symposium, also who are participating in conversations amongst friends and colleagues, and in formal spaces and in informal spaces amongst our family and friends, all of us are really feeling this burning desire for immediate and decisive action. And that's why we show up here today. That's why we show up in all the various places where this work is being carried out. But at the same time that we're feeling this desire and this need to act, we're also trying to balance that with the knowledge that the hatred and the oppression and the injustice that we are so determined to eradicate, those same unjust systems that we've inherited and that our parents faced and their parents faced and our grandparents faced, they're not going to be dispensed with in a matter of years. It's not going to be a quick process. We are hoping that we're at a turning point and that this path that has been so painstakingly and with so much sacrifice and dedication been created by those who came before us, that we're on that path. And our sincere hope is to continue to widen that path until it becomes the only reasonable way forward. So we gather here today from a variety of different areas of study and different disciplines. And our hope is that by focusing on this question of means and ends, we can somehow gain a deeper understanding. We can inch ourselves a little bit closer to understanding how to best seize the moment that we're in and to use it for all that we can. And we're going to start with a few comments from Dr. Michael Carlberg. Michael's research in the field of peace and justice studies has explored the implicit assumptions about change and how they have informed various social movements. And his current research is specifically focused on this question of means and ends. Hi, Michael.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Elizabeth writes about art from the African diaspora. And she founded the Bunch Washington Foundation recently to support artists of all genres with a special interest in Black visual artists. And I know from conversations over the years that Elizabeth has deep insights into how the arts motivate and also foster unique modes of understanding that can inform processes of social change, which we'll hear more about later from Elizabeth. Elizabeth alluded to a long historical struggle for justice in this country. And in light of its ongoing nature of this struggle, it might help to reflect for a moment on the ends of this struggle. Toward what ends are we attempting to bend the long arc of justice? To my understanding, our aspiration for social justice springs from a recognition that we're all members of a single interdependent social body. And within this social body, the well-being of every individual and every group ultimately derives from the well-being of the entire body. But the American social body has, from its inception, suffered from conditions of profound social and spiritual disease. So what movements for social justice aspire towards, in my understanding, is a condition in which every individual and group has the resources, the opportunities, the freedom, and the encouragement to develop their latent potentialities so that everyone can contribute to the health and well-being of the entire social body. In many ways, this is what the third panel in this symposium, the panel on solidarity, was offering important insights into. So if this, broadly speaking, is the end we seek, then we need to ask, by what means can we best advance toward this end? Protagonists of social change have been debating this question of ends and means throughout the history of this country. One thing we can probably all agree on is that complacency in the face of injustice is an affront to justice. But once we move beyond complacency, there are a wide range of means available across a spectrum from violent to nonviolent. And we know the 20th century saw a steady shift toward nonviolent means, driven by a growing recognition that our means need to be coherent with our ends, because our means prefigure our ends. But even within the tradition of nonviolence, there are a wide range of means available. I want to highlight some that are maybe among the least well understood, but I believe will prove essential in the long run. I'm talking about means that focus on the construction of entirely new social forms based on new premises about human nature and social reality. Now, the fourth panel of this symposium began to touch on this theme at the level of building new patterns of local community life and the individual transformation that can require. I want to touch on what this kind of constructive agency looks like in another domain, the domain of governance, as a kind of a way of illustrating what I'm talking about. Think about the forms of governance that emerged from Western liberalism, right? These systems undoubtedly have a few merits, especially when compared to authoritarian alternatives. But since their inception, Western liberal democracies have produced countless laws and policies that are patently unjust. And they continue to do so even as we speak. So many movements for social justice legitimately focus on opposing and dismantling these unjust laws and policies. That's important work. But the recurrent necessity of this work points to a deeper issue that ultimately needs to be faced. How can we construct new forms of governance that are not so susceptible to abuses of power by self-interested actors and groups? How can we construct new forms of governance that we can all trust? Because the systems we've inherited are by design susceptible to abuse. And as a result, these systems are now suffering from a universal crisis of legitimacy. So to address the problem at this level, we need to engage in what I've come to call radical constructive agency. Now, by radical, what I mean is getting to the roots of the problem or the foundations. And by constructive agency, I mean actively building on new foundations, more just political, economic, and other social systems that can eventually supplant the unjust systems we've inherited. So back to my example, we've inherited competitive electoral systems that pit candidates and parties against one another in continuous contests of power. Among the many problems with this model, these contests are expensive. So they're invariably influenced by inherited distributions of wealth and power. It's part of what makes these systems so susceptible to continuous corruption and abuse by powerful vested interests. I think everyone understands this, right? But this model of competitive democracy has become so naturalized that many people think it's inevitable now, or they think it's just the best that humans are capable of. So think about it. This system, which was invented before the invention of the steam engine or before electricity, has somehow come to constrain our social imaginations. Fortunately, if we look hard enough, we can see that processes of social learning in this domain have not come to an end. Across the planet today, processes of social innovation are demonstrating that, for instance, elections can actually be organized without any competition in ways that offer voters true freedom of choice and consistently yield more just and equitable outcomes. I've written about these models, and I invite people who are serious about the struggle for social justice to examine them. This is the kind of foundational work that needs to advance alongside the work of changing specific laws and policies. And when we think along these lines, we can recognize that the construction of more mature social institutions, like in the realm of governance, has to go hand in hand then with the development of more mature patterns of community life. And that both of those processes are inseparable from the transformation of hearts and minds. So we need to advance simultaneously on all three of these fronts with radical constructive agency, I believe. But these are themes other panelists are going to touch on. So on that note, I want to hand the microphone, so to speak, to June Manning Thomas to share some insights. June is a professor of urban planning who's conducted research on race and justice over a number of years with a focus on city redevelopment in places like Detroit, but she's also focused her research on the civil rights movement in the Jim Crow South. So June, please.
Thank you, Michael, for those great comments. That was a great segue, a great entree into our panel. Also appreciate Liz framing the situation that we're facing right now. I would like to just mention a couple of things about this urban planning background that Michael referred to, because that actually is a sphere of governance. And I thought he made some great comments about the challenges that face us in terms of just governance, because so much of what we've seen in terms of the effects of racism and injustice are reflected within the realm of cities and city government and urban planning itself. So we see things like entrenched poverty. That's because essentially we've walled off certain areas of metropolitan of governance from people that don't have means. We see redlining, we see discrimination and prejudice in terms of housing. And so those things are just sort of symptoms of the kind of injustice that can be reflected in governance, as Michael pointed out. But today I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about something else, because although most of my adult life I've spent kind of documenting those problems, most of my research and most of my writing has been on documenting what's happened in terms of governance gone awry in places such as Detroit. I've also, over the last few years, turned my attention to what I thought was a purer form of study of racism and a social response to racism. And that's essentially the civil rights movement. So I've been sort of delving into this whole concept of civil rights, and I'd like to just make some comments about what that suggests to me, particularly from my own spiritual background and spiritual training in terms of what the means and ends are. So as I look at this period, and the period I've been looking at specifically is especially 1954 to 1968, which one of the panelists mentioned yesterday is sort of this classic civil rights movement. It was mentioned as one of the times when we saw the possibility for the races to come together, along with emancipation and along with populism. The civil rights era is so critical to understanding this issue of where are we going in the future. That's when we saw extraordinary leadership. We saw some connection with the ideas of people like Gandhi. We saw the creation of some concepts about how do we go forth toward the desired ends using, in that case, nonviolent and organizational means. So that was a time when, excuse me, we thought that perhaps we understood how to bring about the ends that we wished. And I just happened to have been alive during that period. So I remember with great fondness the civil rights rallies and just the feeling of rightness, the feeling that we were undertaking a campaign that would lead us into the future in a way that was so much better than the present. This was especially important for those of us who grew up under Jim Crow, who had suffered from white supremacy, had suffered from not being given our full rights as citizens. And that period was a time when we thought we saw the connection between means and ends in a way that we could essentially keep for the rest of our lives, that this would set the country on the path that it should be. So we had this concept, but then, as you well know, that concept of supreme progress in American society was somewhat derailed. It was derailed by assassination. It was derailed by having some legislation passed, such as Michael referred to. We tried to do some things in governance, and yet we see 30, 40, 50 years later, that legislation did not resolve the problem. So I've been thinking a lot about this issue of means and ends, and what did we learn from that particular civil rights movement, and how do we move forward? So to segue to this conference, which has been a wonderful exploration of some of these terms, of some of these trends of racism dating from slavery, for example, of Reconstruction and the implications of all of those trends. So again, going back to this civil rights era and my own upbringing in South Carolina, I should tell you something about why I'm here, why several of us are here. As it happened, as I was participating in that same civil rights movement, I was also looking at this group of people that seemed to be following a slightly different path. And that group of people were members of the Baha'i faith. So I should tell you, as a child of the South and a child of South Carolina and somewhat of a veteran of the civil rights movement, that the Baha'is are people who have, for over 100 years, been trying to create communities that are models of unity, that essentially allow people of different races and different nationalities and different religions to come together under the tent of unity and to begin to love each other and to begin to work together to build a better community. So when I encountered these people in South Carolina, it was a revelation. I'd never seen Black and white people sit at the same table, much less hug each other. I'd never seen friendship like that. Many of us who became interested in social change noticed this community, this religious community that was doing these fantastic things to bring people together. We've been trying to create communities that are moving forward, characterized by racial unity. We feel that we have some incredible insights that we can offer in terms of what works and what doesn't always work in terms of building multiracial communities. And maybe some of that conversation will come out. So I'd like to introduce the next person. The next person is a longtime friend, Michael Penn. If I had to go to a psychologist, I would go to Michael. He's just so wise and has done wonderful things. His field is the relationship between psychological research and human rights, and between culture and mental health. So Michael, please.
Thank you so much, June. It was really terrific. You know, I was thinking, I've been thinking all night really about some of the remarks of Burkhold, who yesterday participated in one of the panels. And one of the things that he said that really struck me is that he said that his work is organized around the human spirit's desire to grow, the desire to change, the desire to be better than we have been in the past. And I was really struck by that because I too, I'm interested in that terrain. I'm really interested sort of in the terrain of the human heart. And I became interested in the terrain of the human heart because of my own clinical research and my own practice, but also because I had gone a couple of years ago to the University of Geneva, and I had visited a lab that studies human emotions. I had done some research in human emotions for a while, but when I encountered this lab, I was really struck by the fact that this lab was studying the phenomenon of being moved. They were interested in the question, what kinds of things move the human heart? What does it mean for the human heart to be moved? And they were engaged in this research both as philosophers and as scientists. So they were uniting these two disciplines to explore this really important question. And they were interested in this question because they believed that when we are being moved, we're in heightened states of vulnerability to change. We're more likely to change when we are being moved. And so I just became sort of interested in this phenomenon. You know, they reminded me of some early research that had shown that even as infants and children, we are very susceptible to the way that human beings speak. So the tone, the volume, the pitch, the cadence of human words has a tremendous influence on the human heart. And we're very mindful of this when we talk to children. When we talk to children, we're acutely aware that the way we speak makes a tremendous difference. But somehow, when we start to talk to other adults, we forget that. We forget how sensitive the human heart is to the way we speak and the words that we use. And oftentimes, actually, the way that we speak and the words that we use shut down the possibility that people can be moved by our words. In fact, what it does is it creates a kind of a barrier between what we are saying and what we intend to achieve. They are incongruent with one another. We want to achieve something. We want to achieve change and growth and development, but the way that we are speaking makes it less likely that that will occur, that that will happen. And so I've just been very, very interested in drawing more and more attention to the way that we use words in dialogue about change, about social change. And my sense is that as we become more refined, more careful, more thoughtful about the use of words, we're going to find that we're more powerful in persuading people who are on the periphery to join in the process of change. I've been thinking a lot about the visit of Abdul Baha, who came to the United States from the Middle East after 40 years of imprisonment. And when he came to the United States, one of the reasons why he came was that he wanted to persuade the Americans that they could be more successful at achieving solidarity between the Blacks and the whites. And he came at a time when actually lynch mobs were the standard of race relations in the United States. And so at an interracial gathering, he said something really, really interesting. He said, in the clustered jewels of the races, may the Blacks be as sapphires and rubies, and the whites as diamonds and pearls. The composite beauty of humanity will be witnessed in their unity and blending. What he wanted to do was he wanted to speak both to this, he wanted to deconstruct the image of interracial relationships from that image that had been produced by the separatist. He wanted to create a vision of beauty out of this sullied image that had been saturating the thinking, saturating the hearts of Blacks and whites for centuries. And so he used words that penetrated the hearts of many people who listened to him. And he invited us to be extremely conscious, even as the Native Americans had been, about the use of language. I got from him the sense that it may be that words are the most powerful force in the natural world. And as we learn to use these words, use our words wisely and with refinement, we will be able to move hearts in directions that are profitable for the future. So that's an area that I'd like to explore a little bit while we're together. Professor Derek Smith, whose scholarship focuses really on African-American literature, is a wonderful, wonderful, youthful, dynamic mind. And he's going to share a few thoughts just to get us moving a little bit further along in these directions.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone and to be in dialogue about this question of means and ends. And it seems to me, from my perspective, as both a person who's deeply involved in the reading of Black intellectual history and contemporary theorizing around ideas of social change from a Black studies perspective, and as a person who grew up in the 1990s, you know, I came of age, you could say, in that moment of a kind of efflorescence of a kind of quasi-Black nationalism. And to think about the question of means and ends for me coming out of that context immediately brings up the idea of Malcolm X in that famous photograph holding the shotgun, and beneath that image, the caption, "by any means necessary." And that comes out of a talk that Fanon had given about 5 years before Malcolm was killed, in which he suggested that the means that may be necessary for the colonized to throw off the psychological impositions of colonialism were violent. And that when Malcolm evoked that idea of any means being necessary to achieve the ends of justice and equity for Black people, he also had the idea of putting on the table the possibility of the use of violence, right? But I think that when he did that, he had also gone on pilgrimage. He went on Hajj to Mecca at that time. And he was also powerfully moved by these other kinds of means to achieve an end of justice. And he saw that in the coming together of all these different people from all over the world in the process of prostrating before a raceless Allah. And I think for me, that's a really powerful idea, because it forces us to contemplate, I think, meditate deeply upon this idea of any means necessary. And it forces us, and particularly me as a Baha'i, to think about what are the means, what are those other means of achieving the ends of solidarity and unity and justice that we want to see that have been underexplored, right? What are these ways of attending to things like the heart, right? That Dr. Penn just evoked, the spirit. Like, how can we begin to incorporate those into our efforts to bring about social change in a way that is receiving more attention, that is theorized perhaps more deeply than it has been? And this is not just to sort of say that we need to return to the ideas of Dr. King or something like that. And Dr. King had a wonderful concept that has been important to nonviolent theories of social change for some times, which is that the ends are pre-existent in the means, right? So I think that we do have to take this into account. If we are seeking a certain kinds of ends, we must realize that the means that we will use to achieve that ends has to be present now, right? We need to, as Dr. Karlberg mentioned earlier, prefigure the ends that we want to achieve in the present. And I think that that is a very difficult kind of work, right? And it requires a kind of imagination that is hard to foster in the context that Liz had described in her opening context, in her opening remarks here. But that it is something that we need to learn our way into. We need to figure out those tools that we can use that will not simply dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde has suggested, right? But that will help us build a new kind of house, a new house with different social structures and social systems as compared to those that we're dealing with right now. And of course, I'm speaking in very symbolic and conceptual terms. And I think that these concepts and symbols are important for helping us to theorize a way forward, right? So when we think about social change, oftentimes we're thinking about altering the current system, right? But I think that social change can also involve the creation of new structures, the building, the construction of new structures. And I think as a Baha'i, this is what I'm most interested in. Quite recently, Isabel Wilkerson has put into the sort of American consciousness this idea of the American house that we live in as like an old Victorian home that is built upon a framework that is vitiated by anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and that there has been too long an ignoring of this fact. But there are some who have been quite attentive to this for some time, and those who have been attentive to it have taken different approaches to their efforts to live in this house. Some have tried to adjust and alter and tweak the systems of the house, the fixtures, so to speak. Some have tried to rebuild the house in certain ways. Others have tried to actually tear down the house, right? Figuring that sometimes a structure is too dangerous to live in. So the best thing to do is tear it down. But I think from a Baha'i perspective, and going back to the comments that June had made earlier about the ways in which Baha'is have been trying to build interracial community using imaginative forms of solidarity, that we might conceive of another relationship to this old house that we're living in. And that's a relationship where we are drawing elements from this house, materials from this house to build something new. And that new house may be perhaps in the courtyard of this old house of Western liberal democracy, but it's not quite in it. It's something different. And it's something that we're learning about. And it seems to me that the only way that we can do that is through this undying commitment to principles of love, unity, justice, and equity, and a strong recognition, on the other hand, of the reality and the power of ideologies of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, yet never losing hope that there is the necessity and the possibility of building something new. And so, as I said, I think that one of the main ways that we have to at least conceive of or symbolize our efforts into the future is using creative tools, tools that are perhaps unimagined yet. Perhaps if we're thinking about by any means necessary, the necessary means are things that have not yet even been imagined. And we have to become creative in our efforts to do that. And so as I'm thinking about this, I want to turn back to Liz, because, you know, as a creative artist and a writer, someone who's deeply involved in the creative process, I think that, you know, you have a perspective on the means for achieving change from the lens of the artist that can be really helpful, at least for me, in thinking about how we make our way forward.
These have been really such, thank you, Derek. You know, my mind is kind of sifting through all of these wonderful insights that have been brought forth, not just on this panel, but on the panels that came before. And I look at things, for better or for worse, I look at things through the lens of an artist. And it took me a while to realize that that was either what was wrong with me or what was right with me, or maybe a little bit of both, right? So some of us live in this world, whether we're practicing the craft as a profession or not, by seeing things through this artistic lens. And now technology has allowed even more and more people to see this artistic lens. You know, it's taken away a lot of the gatekeepers. Before, we would see the art that was put forth by a mainstream with all of these commercial interests. And of course, we still see that. But at the same time, not replacing, but rising up alongside of that, we are seeing art that comes from anyone who wants to create art, whether it's performance art, in these skits, these really innovative and kind of hilarious skits that people put together where they play all the characters and then they just kind of post it, and you get, you know, 500,000 people saying, oh my gosh, that's me, that's exactly how I am. Or the folk art that is appearing on the walls of the world as we use visual art as a way to express what we're feeling. And when I think about all of the potential of this moment and all of the different things that we are building and how to figure out what is the best way forward, I can't help but think of the creative process itself. So everyone who puts attention on creating has a different process, but there are certain things that are in common. There are certain things throughout the history of time, I think, that are in common, and that is the need to bring yourself and all of your experiences and all of the things you've learned and all of the books you've read and all of the conversations you've had, you bring this to the work, right? Your work is informed by all of this. But at the same time, you have to step back from the self. You have to remove yourself. You have to look for the things that are really going to ruin, for lack of a better word, something great that you're creating. If you put too much coming from the ego, right? Coming from that self-interest into this work, then you just kind of limit it in so many ways. And that's all of the great artists and all of the people who live through art without even thinking of themselves as artists. That's a part of it. And I think that it's the attitude that you bring to it is as important or more important than the end result that you have in mind, because the result that you have in mind is limited by your own conception, your own lack of experience in what's possible, right? You may have had some things that you're drawing on, but to understand, hey, I have ideas. And now when I put that idea out and other people chime in, through all of that kaleidoscope, something new, completely new that has never existed before is going to come through. But it requires a giving and also a detachment. And I think that that's where we're really being tested right now. We have so much that we want to give. We're burning to give, but at the same time, we have to detach from our idea of it has to look this way. Here's, all of my thousands of reasons why I have to convince you basically that what I've thought of is right, and that what other people are thinking of is almost right, but not quite right. Anyway, without going on and on, I do think that there's a lot to learn from people who are in this process all the time. The artists of the world have a voice in all of this. And really, it's remarkable, because when we're able to achieve that kind of creative unity, something emerges that's so much better than what we envisioned in the first place. So I don't know how much that seems to relate to the topic that we're talking about, but that's certainly the way that I think of it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liz. I mean, I feel as though like creative processes are, and the creative spirit is something like a resource, right? And that resource is sometimes, it seems to me, kind of in short supply, and maybe and the kinds of imaginative forms of art making that can bring about social change sometimes appear to be crowded out, right, by these other kinds of visions, these artistic visions that are more geared toward older systems of, maintaining ideologies that are oppressive and so forth. And, there's a well-known idea from Frederick Jameson that, in Hollywood cinema, for example, it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world, right, than to imagine the end of capitalism, or to imagine the end of a kind of injustice rooted in race. Like it's hard for us to even conceive of that. And it seems to me that artists in their creative work who move beyond those constraints that are imposed by the industries, right, that are seeking primarily profit in their artistic processes is so important. And I think both Dr. Carlberg and Dr. Penn have important ideas for us around, or have thought a lot about this concept of power, right? Who has power? How is power used to achieve certain kinds of social ends? And as I said before, in the art, in the cultural industries, it seems as though the vast majority of power is concentrated within a few select huge corporations, and then there are these smaller artists who try to sort of break free of some of the constraints that are imposed by these larger entities. But I think, Dr. Carlberg, you have some ideas about how we can think about power in which are themselves creative. These ideas about power, I think, are creative. And if you could share a few of those, I'd appreciate that.
Thanks, everyone, for your thoughts so far. When we think about power and social change, we often think about oppositional expressions of power, right? The fight for power. And no doubt, many significant social advances have occurred through contests of power. In those rare moments when the balance of power tips towards meaningful social change, and before it tips back towards regression. But it's easy when we're thinking about power, it's easy to overlook other expressions of power that in the long run might prove more essential to sort of lasting social change. I mean, we just heard a little bit about artists and the power of imagination, which is, it's not just something that gets expressed, on paper or in performance, but it's actually about the power of moving beyond the constraints of the existing social imaginary, right? That I kind of alluded to earlier. What we think is normal and natural and inevitable is a box that constrains us. So the powers of the imagination are a profoundly important aspect of struggles for social change. I would add to that some other powers one can begin to sort of reflect on and think about, how do you harness these? One is the powers of attraction that are exerted when more just social forms are constructed. Because people who are oppressed And I would venture to say there's no one on the planet today who isn't oppressed in some way or another, although forms of oppression are compounded for many and are more acute for some than others. But when people are oppressed, they become naturally attracted to more just arrangements. So the powers of attraction, think for instance of the early Christian communities who were creating entirely new patterns of community life, radical departures from anything that existed, and beginning to attract oppressed people from many backgrounds as those communities multiplied and grew. Same powers of attraction can actually be observed through a careful historical study of the earliest Muslim communities, the earliest Buddhist communities, and many other faith communities throughout history who have successfully constructed more just patterns of community life that attracted growing numbers of people from many backgrounds and changed the course of history in the process, right? And of course, outside the domain of faith communities, similar processes can be observed at key periods in various secular movements. So, the cooperative economics movement of the 19th century was a powerful movement sweeping across Europe, North America, other parts of the world. Or the landless workers movement unfolding in parts of the world today, especially Latin America, in which communities are constructing new patterns of self-governance, of education, of economic cooperation, and attracting growing numbers in the processes. So these are a different kind of power. These are a constructive and attractive power. And related to that, one more I'll just sort of mention is the powers of resilience. So this kind of radical constructive agency I've been talking about, when communities of people begin to construct more just social forms, not surprisingly, some of those people who benefit from the inherited social forms, the status quo, attempt to repress these kinds of movements, right? Pretty familiar pattern throughout history. So constructive agency requires resilience in the face of repression. And this is a different kind of power that we have to learn to draw on. And of course, we have lots of experience with this. We see this dynamic again and again whenever African American communities started to succeed in constructing more just and prosperous patterns of community life on this continent, the repression that they encountered. You can see the same dynamic at play with, for instance, the Baha'is of Iran that some of you are familiar with, who have experienced repression for a century and a half. Well, they've continued to construct more just, open, and inclusive patterns of community life. So these powers of imagination, construction, attraction, resilience are profoundly important in movements for justice. And none of them need be expressed in oppositional ways. One can build without necessarily, confronting. As Derek said, one can build new structure in the courtyard. So these dynamics are different than the sort of familiar contests of power that tend to dominate our thinking about social change, and in fact, can themselves be constraints on our imagination. We, of course, have a lot to learn still about how to tap into and harness these kinds of powers I'm referring to. So let me hand it off to Michael, who's also given a lot of thought to this. I know these questions about power and the powers of the human spirit in this context.
Yeah, a few years ago, when we were in the very heart of the protest and the Black Lives Movement process, I was invited to give a talk to the Kansas City Police Academy. And when I walked into the room, imagine about 500 police officers dressed in blue, 95% of which were white. And on the streets, just down the road, there were these protests about the behavior of police officers. So when I walked into the room really as a traumatologist, wanting to speak with them about what happens to the human heart when African Americans who have been traumatized encounter police officers who have both been traumatized and have been traumatizing. When they meet on the street, what happens? And when I walked into the room, I could immediately detect a lack of receptivity because the skin color prevented any opening for me to say anything that these group of officers would be receptive to. But then I was thinking, this is a moment pregnant with possibilities. I have to do my best. So what I decided to do was I said, what is the one thing that I have in common with these police officers? Well, the one thing that came to my mind was the fact that my brother had been a police officer in New York City. And my brother had been a police officer in New York City who had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, which had caused him to have to retire when he was in his 30s. His partner had been murdered in front of him. And because the shotgun did not go off a second time, his life was saved. And so I just told the police officers at that gathering what had happened to my brother. And I said that my brother is like you. You are like my brother. But the stories that we bring to this encounter have been shaped by many, many centuries of history that I haven't created and that you haven't created, but that we need to learn something about. I was just so struck by how the police officers, and I'm not trying to say that there was a radical transformation. I'm just saying that a space was opened for a kind of dialogue that could not have been opened without an awareness of the careful use of power. You know, power is the ability to affect change. It's the ability to produce outcomes that are desired. And there are different kinds of power. There is constructive power and there's destructive power. If I want to exercise destructive power, I need very little information. It takes very little information to destroy a house, but it takes a lot of information and a lot of energy to build a beautiful house. So the more information that is available to an organism, the more refined can be the expression of the use of power. In fact, when we add to information knowledge, what knowledge does is knowledge tells us how to steer the use of information and energy in a more delicate way towards the achievement of our outcomes. We can do things with knowledge that we can't do with mere information. And in fact, there is another level of power, which I would call wisdom. Wisdom in any situation involving human beings enables us to draw upon different reservoirs of knowledge, different reservoirs of power to do the right thing in the right way for the right reason. There's a wonderful, wonderful quotation that I love. It says, "For every land, we have prescribed a portion. For every occasion, an allotted share. For every pronouncement, an appointed time. And for every situation, an apt remark." And I think that as we think about the use of power in the social movements of the future, we will have to be, I think, increasingly aware of our discharge of our capacity to exercise power. And as we do that, we will attract confirmations. We will attract forms of cooperation, forms of unity, forms of assistance that are presently just a little bit out of reach on many occasions. So those are just some thoughts on that theme.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm really compelled by this idea that you brought in there about, again, with the metaphor of the house and what's needed, the kind of information that's needed to destroy a house is very small in relationship to the kind of information and knowledge and perhaps the complexity and sophistication of the power that's needed to actually build a new structure. And I think that one of the ways that, that I put this in tension with some of the very compelling ideas that, come at what some would call the cutting edge of Black studies and theorizing about modernity, the modern world that we live in, which hold that our modern reality is so indelibly shaped by these structures of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that it is almost impossible to conceive of a future of true solidarity, of true equality between people, and that Black people will always be at the sort of bottom rung of this ladder of modernity, and that modernity, Western modernity, is sort of founded upon this belief. And it seems to me that this is a very, when we frankly look at our world condition, this is a very compelling kind of theorization. Yet at the same time, it seems to me that some of the best challenges to that kind of thinking come in the interpersonal, and the very committed work of people working at the level of community and at the grassroots to create social change. And I know, Dr. Thomas, you have a lot of experience and thinking around the ways in which people working at the grassroots in a kind of person-to-person endeavors are using those means to create change. And I wonder, how do you imagine like these small grassroots efforts between, again, small cadres of people being a means that could lead into a larger kind of social transformation? If you could speak to that, I think that might be helpful to us.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the people that have come before on this conference. I know not everyone is here for all 3 days, so some of us are just here today, but I've been impressed by the way we've seen exactly what you're talking about in some of the previous panels. So for example, yesterday afternoon, we had 2 people, actually there were 3 people who were influenced by the Boggs Center in Detroit. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of information given about the Boggs Center, but some of us in Southeast Michigan are very familiar with this. This was founded by James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs. It was founded as a way to look at empowerment at the community level. And this idea was, maybe we start small. Maybe we start with clusters of people who begin to come together and work together for the greater good. So we saw a glimpse of that yesterday afternoon. This woman, Myrtle Thompson Curtis, was describing it very well. This idea that maybe you create power in part by not so much focusing on those broader realms of power over which you have no control, but identifying those smaller realms in which you do have control. And so she was talking about this idea of looking at taking back, for example, the food sources that you depend upon, and looking at how can you bring neighbors together so that they can begin to help each other with their food needs and to build community. So she was describing a situation where ostensibly she was talking about community gardening, but actually she was talking about community building and increasing power for a powerless neighborhood. I know the neighborhood she's talking about very well, and to the outsider, it looks like there's nothing going on there. And yet she was holding testimony to the fact that you can have people in situations like that indeed do decide to build power as a joint venture, regardless of race, regardless of which people are there. It happens to be a predominantly African-American neighborhood, but it doesn't have to be. So again, I think part of this question of how do we build power and how do we build together interracial relationships, part of it is developing certain strategies to address community building. We've been talking about this a lot in the Baha'i community. You know, how do you essentially bring people on a block together, or people who are in a neighborhood together, or people in a village together to start to build community? So that's one way. But that framework is often not enough. I think what we haven't mentioned yet is there are going to be barriers to that. So you mentioned Wilkerson's book, Caste. That's a great example of explaining the barriers. And we have other books that have talked about that as well. Stamped from the Beginning is a wonderful one that goes back and looks at history and points out to us what some of the barriers are historically and what some of the barriers. Of course, Wilkerson's focuses more on what some of the barriers are right now. And the barriers are this legacy of racism, this legacy of not respecting each other, the legacy of one race thinking it's better than the other race, or the other race feeling bad about itself because it's been told that it's lesser than. So we need a theoretical framework to help us overcome that legacy of prejudice. So this is what the Baha'is have been doing for some time, trying to tap this theoretical framework for helping us to understand how to overcome those differences. For example, one of the leaders of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi, wrote a letter to American Baha'is at the very end of 1938, and he said, this is what you have to do to overcome racism within your own community and in the country at large. There are certain things that whites have to do, and there are certain things that Blacks have to do, but we have to understand that this is something that doesn't involve just one race. It will take effort, it will take work, and it takes effort on all sides. So I think what we have to do is we have to begin to think of, okay, so we have this legacy of racial difference and this legacy of otherness. How do we begin to overcome that? Well, part of it is this organizational building from the grassroots, but part of it is understanding what are the key concepts that help us to overcome this racism that we've been born and bred, that has been born and bred within the American mindset, within the American population. So that's, gosh, I could talk all day about that, but I'm trying to not.
Thank you, June. I really appreciate this. I feel as though there are questions coming in, and we might turn to some of those now. And one of the questions that's come in is something that I think, is always something that is at the forefront of my mind is, how do we encourage and compel people to involve themselves in these kinds of processes of solidarity, interracial solidarity, as we work toward some kind of vision of love and justice and unity, when there seems to be so much inertia sort of pulling people away from involvement at all, right? Or particularly that kind of involvement. And so how do you, Liz, how do you see us encouraging people to do that? How do we compel or inspire people to participate in some of this very creative and experimental almost work that we're advocating for here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one that a lot of people spend time thinking about, because when you have a vision, or at least the beginning of a vision or the shape of a vision, and you're working towards that vision, it's not always something that you can just communicate, right? Because sometimes your ideas of it are still evolving. You just know it's something good. And it's something, again, that urgency that we talked about, we're going to act, we're going to take action. And often we have a lot of ideas around it. Okay, I'm going to do this initiative in my neighborhood. I know that it's wonderful. I'm going to reach out to this person. Oh, so-and-so is definitely gonna come, or they need to come because it fits in, all of this kind of swarm of ideas. But what I have found, and what I have to relearn every single time I get involved in a project like this that seeks to unify and that has these kind of ideals that seem so lofty and many would think unachievable, what I have to remember is that when you do something good and you do it to the best of your ability, you're never going to do it perfectly, right? Because we're not perfect people. But when you have this vision, you don't have to persuade people. when you begin to act, and you act from the purity of your heart, or for me, at least, I find the corner that's pure, and then try to spread that purity to the corners of the heart that maybe are hanging on the edge of purity. But when you focus on that spark of goodness and truth and purity, and you begin to act, then that attraction that we've been talking about starts to happen. And it doesn't always happen in the way that you envisioned it. In fact, it often doesn't. But when you focus on that, you don't have to worry all the other logistical things. Yes, you'll still think about them and make your choices, but that becomes really on the back, that becomes secondary. You don't have to persuade people, they will come. Think about when you see something wonderful, when you see the ocean and all of those signs that people put up, oh, beach, relax, come here, 2 for 1. People come because it's good. Animals come. Everyone comes. When something is good, people will come. Now, they may not come at the time you want them to, but truth always prevails. So to me, yes, it is discouraging, but I study the tradition of Black visual artists. And none of these people should ever attempt to have art as their profession if they were to look at the statistics, if they were looking to the odds arrayed against them. Who would do that? It's completely unimaginable. But they have a vision and they have a piece of truth inside them that they are going to share. And sometimes that truth is made apparent while they're alive and they're there to enjoy it. We hear all the jokes about we can't celebrate the artists until they're gone. Right now there's a lot of talk, this wonderful old saying from African-American tradition about giving people their flowers while they're still alive to smell them has kind of come back into circulation. But you do a thing because it's good, because you can do it, because it's right, and you don't know if it will be recognized or accepted in that moment. But I have found that when you do that, you begin to attract other people who also have that same integrity and that same purity of vision, and the thing people are persuaded that you never intended to persuade. So it's less about getting other people to see the right way, although I have been stuck in that place many times, but it's less about that than actually doing the thing and blocking out. You have to have those blinders where you block out all the reasons that it should fail. And then I think you find that it comes back 100-fold.
Can I share an example of this that has really been moving me lately? We have forgotten about this young girl whose name was Emma Lazarus. When Emma Lazarus was 14 years old, she said that she wanted to inspire the American people to accept more Germans who were being persecuted in Europe into the United States. And she didn't know how that she would do this, but she said, at 14 years old, she said, I am a writer. And so I shall write words. And I believe that my words will somehow affect the American people. And she is that young girl that wrote that extraordinary poem, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman, whose torch is the imprisoned lightning, her name mother of exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Can you imagine being 14, 15, 16 years old and writing words of this nature? And she wrote, that wasn't even her best poem. that was just one of them. She also was reading the works of other writers. For example, Victor Hugo in France. She was reading his work and she was translating his work. And she had the sense that her time was very short. She had just had the intuition that she wouldn't have a lot of time. Sure enough, they discovered that she has leukemia and she's dying. And so she just starts going crazy, writing these incredible works. I understand that she leaves the country And she's on the way back into the country just when the Statue of Liberty is being set in place. And when the ship is just about to turn into the harbor, she dies. So she doesn't see the effects that she will have in the years to come from that little poem that she wrote, wishing to have an impact on the world. And so I just say that, I use that as an example of, you know, our little effort purely carried out with noble intentions can have reverberations that will last well beyond our ability to imagine. You know, I had mentioned Victor Hugo, and Victor Hugo once said that nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And one gets the sense that there are certain ideas in the world whose time has come. And they resonate for that reason with the human heart. They vibrate with the spirit of the times. And so they have an influence that's greater than one would expect if they were ideas that were uttered, say, 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. It's a period of tremendous pregnancy. And in a sense, we have the perception that we are called to be midwives in our little way to giving birth to something that is struggling to be born in the world. None of us yet know what it looks like, but we do have the sense that if we behave in a particular way, when we're in relationship to others. Who was that fellow? Berkhold again said, I do not believe that ideas transform people. That's what he said yesterday. I do not believe that ideas transform people. He says that it's the nexus of ideas and relationships that transform people. And I think that he was absolutely right about that.
Go ahead, Jim,
Derek,
please.
if I may, I also wrote down, that's amazing, Michael. I also wrote down what he said about that, because it was wonderful. He said basically he'd learned that ideas don't move people, connections and relationships move people. So I see in the question some people have been asking, okay, so how do we do this? How do we marry means and ends? And there's one answer. You know, some of us are trying in our everyday relationships and in our weekly activities to just build in a little bit of space for this end that we want. If we're talking today about multiracial unity, just build a little bit of space in that. And it may not be very impressive if you look at it from the outside. So like every week in our household, we host like just a little meeting. It's on Zoom now. It's just a little meeting with a diverse group of friends of several different races and several different religious backgrounds. And we kind of, a lot of times we look at inspirational readings, a lot of times we just converse, but we're trying to build this little nucleus of people that can be strengthened in this idea of the end being a multiracial society that is not governed by prejudice. So sometimes we're simply talking about everyday topics, and yet what we're doing is we're creating the means by which we can reach the ends that we want. So if you scale that up, you know, here we are able to create these little communities that can, as the term I used before that the conference organizers use, is model, that can model the kind of society that we're trying to create. And this gets us away from thinking too big. You know, sometimes we feel paralyzed by the enormity of the problems. You know, sometimes maybe we should just not look at the news some days so that we can kind of not be overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems and start with our own households, our own neighborhoods, our own organizations to build the future we want to see. Just like that young lady that was she's envisioning the future she wants to see. Artists are envisioning this future. Maybe we can do that in everyday life as well.
Thanks for that, June. I think that one of the things I wanted to do is try and bring together two of the questions that have come in from the audience. And one has to do with this question of time and temporality. And basically the question is, well, these are wonderful ideas, but how long will we have to wait for their fruition? In the face of a kind of the enormity of the problems that we're seeing before us, like you just mentioned, Dr. Thomas. So, it's almost as though we don't have any time. That's what some people feel, and that we need to make immediate change. And then I think sort of allied to that, maybe there could be some form of skepticism around some of these strategies, because there is the idea that there is something about human nature that is inherently conflictual, right? Attracted to conflict. And so I wonder, Dr. Carberg, if you could talk a little bit about this idea of the premise that, human beings are essentially, beings who are meant to be in conflict. And then also perhaps if you could, like, the idea of like the time frame, the horizon that we're thinking about in terms of creating change using means that are other than conflictual means.
Sure. Yeah, this question of human nature, I mean, it's so important that we arrive at a coherent understanding of human nature upon which, like, we base our actions, right? And our expectations of how others are capable of acting and such. And we have inherited in the West a long tradition of reducing human nature to its most sort of conflictual, competitive instincts. And there's no doubt human beings are capable of competition and conflict and self-interested action and so forth. But what the human sciences actually tell us, if we look carefully, is that humans are wired for both competition and cooperation, or for both egoism and altruism. And the question of which of those sort of latent potentials develops most is a function of our social environment, our education, our training, our parenting, and make choices we make throughout our life, and the institutions and incentives we interact with in our society. So in the Western world, it shouldn't be surprised, almost every institution we interact with incentivizes us or expects us to act in competitive and self-interested ways. And then we look at how humans behave in that context and we say, see, humans are just fundamentally aggressive and selfish and competitive. So, but the fact that we have the latent capacity for both raises the important questions. Then how do we start to develop our more cooperative, mutualistic, altruistic capacities more effectively, more systematically, more universally? And of course, that begins with children in their formative age and how they're raised and educated. And in their second formative age in adolescence, and how they begin to develop those sort of budding capacities of maturity that they'll be entering into. So I mean, that's a much larger discussion, but if we recognize that humans have the latent capacity to actually overcome our competitive and aggressive instincts and to act on more mature, what many would call, sort of spiritual capacities, latent spiritual capacities, then that changes our calculus in terms of how we do the work. What is it we're trying to achieve and how do we get there? What are the means? Because some of those means have to do then with fostering latent capacities in the sort of education, awareness raising, and so forth. In terms of the time frame, I mean, these are challenging questions because clearly there's a need for urgent action. So any discussion of time frame is not about, let's just be patient. This just takes time. We just need to wait. That's not the case at all. Urgent action is needed from growing numbers of people to address desperate conditions in the world today. Even aside from race and these conditions of social injustice like climate change and these other desperate urgent conditions need urgent action. So we need urgent action, but we need forms of action that align with long-term goals as well, long-term sort of accomplishments as well. So it's a bit like if you think about the whole sort of range of attending to human health, in like emergency situations, you need triage. You need to be able to quickly sort of sort and respond to the most urgent needs. But somehow, if all we do is that kind of triage, we never think about actually like building health. The long-term sort of work of building health, the kind of preventative healthcare, that sort of, so we need to be doing both, but somehow we need to be doing them in ways that are fully sort of coherent and aligned. The sort of short-term, immediate, urgent needs, and the sort of long-term work. Clearly, some of this work will take a long time. An urgent project might be, dismantling some horrendous discriminatory law or policy that's on the books today. But again, the long-term work is creating institutions that don't continually throw up new laws of that kind. If we're not attending to both, we'll never escape the sort of trap of the short-term sort of triage, mentality.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that. I wanted to sort of bring in this concept of dismantling existing social structures and ally that to a question that's come in that's asking us to think about what is the relationship between this kind of, let's say, dismantling work that involves sort of like oppositional protest and efforts to alter policy and so forth. And then this other kind of constructive means of agency that we're talking about and how those are thought in relation to one another. And it seems to me, Michael, that you kind of touched on, this kind of triage approach in which there is no denial of the need to dismantle immediately oppressive structures. And yet at the same time, right, Dr. Thomas's husband once mentioned this to me, Richard Thomas, about what he called a distribution of labor, that there are different kinds of labor which are necessary for creating a new, social reality. And that there are those who may be involved in this dismantling process, and then there are others who may be involved in more constructive processes that are about the creation of these relationships, particularly relationships with those who are suffering under acute oppression in this time. And I think about that in relation to some of the work that I've been doing for the past decade or so inside of prisons. And one of the things that's quite interesting is to see that those who are involved really in the hands-on day-to-day work of offering up educational opportunities for those who are currently incarcerated oftentimes have to concentrate all of their energies on those relationships that they have with incarcerated students in order that this kind of liberating sense of self and knowledge can come to students inside the prison. There is a focus on that particular relationship less than on the structure itself, right? The oppressive structure of the prison. That is not to say that one is in favor of or complacent in the face of this oppressive structure, but it is to say that if you're going to do a good job of being a educator in an incarcerated in the context of the carceral state, you really have to think deeply about those relationships with your students, right? And then in so doing, right, in developing the capacity and in accompanying those who are incarcerated in their educational journeys, you sometimes have to work with those figures of authority, right, who the activist is likely to point the finger at. So, for example, correctional officers or the wardens of a prison or something like that, who are in charge of keeping this oppressive institution in order. For the prison educator, you need to be at least in camaraderie with those individuals so that the relationship with the incarcerated student can prosper and flourish. right? So it's not to say that this is a zero-sum game where you forget about the dismantling of these oppressive social structures while doing this constructive work, right? It's as though there are two processes, there are different processes that can happen simultaneously. I saw that Elizabeth, you had your hand, you had seemed to want to speak to one of these issues earlier. Is that right?
Perhaps.
I'm sorry.
I got into your story about I'm imagining everything that you were describing and forgot about any thoughts that I had. But I think this idea of power and what to do when it's all arrayed against you, you know, whether you are fighting for truth or just fighting for mere survival. It reminds me a lot of this concept that I kind of, some of my friends have heard me talk about, this concept that I created for myself, maybe even for survival, and I call it the effort bank. And the effort bank, you know, speak about the power of language to transform the way that we think about things or how sensitive our hearts are to different things. I came up with this idea of the effort bank because of all the efforts that I put into anything, seemingly with no result, or sometimes with even disastrous results, right? And I'm the only one that knows that I was trying my best and had all great intentions. You know, misunderstandings are everywhere. You try to do something, it's misunderstood. No, that's not what I meant. I mean, there's no amount of explaining in the world that can bring a person to look through your eyes in the way that you want them to. So what do we have left after all of that? We just have our effort, right? And if we give that up, then we have nothing. So I came up with this idea of the effort bank that when I try to do something, whether it's large or small, and I have this, you know, this kind of really sacrificial and altruistic aim, I'm making a deposit into the effort bank. And when it doesn't work out at all, I have not just fell on my face, I have made a substantial deposit into the effort bank. And the great thing about this bank, well, the sad thing about the bank is I can't just roll up to the bank and say, okay, I'm here for my withdrawal. You know, I put all this effort in and cut me a check because I need it by Friday, right? The effort bank does not work that way. But what the effort bank does is it accrues interest and it pays me a check when it wants to pay me a check. It rewards me when it wants to reward me. And sometimes at a moment when I've given up all hope, or at a moment when I've tried everything, it didn't work, and boom, I look at my account and what is that? I have just received an unsolicited payment from this effort bank, and something that was impossible or hard or implausible just fell into place with no effort from me. But I know that it's not really no effort. I know all those other efforts, which, you know, I kept hearing June talk about, it looks small from the outside, or from the outside looking in, it seems insignificant, or these tiny things we do. You know, we never know the ripple effects that we're creating when we do our best to, not just for other people, but to use language that encourages us as well. My dad used to say, in the tradition of the African-American tradition of speaking to children in a way to get them to do what they need to do, he would say, fix your face. That always burned me. Like, what do you mean fix my face? It's bad enough I have to do what you say. Now you want my face to somehow appear, you know, thankful under these conditions, right? And also, is there anything wrong with my face? Like, what do you mean fix it? And now I find myself as a mom telling my children all the time, like, look at your attitude. Let's, you know, get that together before you do anything else. And for me personally, I just think it would be impossible to go on if I looked at the stark reality as it appears, as it's revealing itself. There's a whole other reality. There's a whole other power that when you somehow align yourself with that power, things happen. That's the only way, you know, it'll make a mystic out of you. It'll make a mystic out of the most practical of us. And anyway, the effort bank. So may all of your checks arrive at the moment that you most need it.
I think maybe the last deposit into the effort bank that we're putting in here can be made by Dr. Thomas. I saw that you had your hand up there earlier. Got a couple more
Yeah.
minutes.
This is just in response to the question of what do we do now? And what about all of the, although Liz has responded to this as well, I think we have to just perhaps end by saying, we aren't saying you only do small things. There's some of us that are able as well to work on large scale reform. And I think we have to do that. So in my own classroom, for example, I taught urban planners who were going to work for city government. So I taught them how to make larger scale reforms because we want to have simultaneously the larger scale initiatives as well as the smaller scale. And we didn't really go into that, but I think it would also apply to what Derek was saying. That, you know, basically you want to reform the prison system and yet you still have to operate within the parameters of that prison system.
Yeah, thank you everyone for contributing to what I think has been a really rich and fruitful discussion. I think the ideas that we've brought out here today and the way that we've discussed them is rare, I think, actually. And I'm grateful that we were able to put this together and for the efforts that everyone has put in here to have this panel. And for all of my comrades here, I say thank you, and I enjoyed this discussion a lot. Look forward to working with you all in the future.